these firms are not moving fast enough. Their moats are drying up. Inflection points are when there is a 10x change in what is possible. We're moving, we believe, from the era of prediction machines to the era of imagination machines.
Is disruption a threat or an opportunity? Scott Wolfson is here to share how the very foundations of business, strategy and innovation are being shaken up by inflection points and imagination machines. Today's guest joins us from North Carolina. He's the co-founder of Valize, and he describes himself modestly as a curious human. So his name is Scott Wolfson. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Steve. It is a delight to be here. I will slightly reframe. I would say I'm a co-founder, maybe of Valize Advisory, but we can get into the nuances there. It's an absolute privilege and pleasure to join you on the Culture Edge podcast.
And of course, David's our co-host as well.
Nice to meet you, Scott.
Just an absolute thrill to be here with you, David.
So welcome. Maybe you could just kick it off by introducing yourself and telling us more about who you are and what animates you.
Boy, I think it's fair to say, Steve, that there's very little that doesn't animate me. I do self-identify first and foremost as a curious human. I think as so many of us have done over the past few years, it's easy to put a benchmark on it. Certainly for me, since at least March 11th, 2020, when the World Health Organization declared the novel coronavirus pandemic a pandemic, that I've done a lot of reflection and introspection. And the more I think about it, the more I exercise my insatiable curiosity, the more I realize that that is really what has guided me through my entire life. I've often joked that my life is nothing but a series of ongoing experiments and plenty that I have abandoned along the way, but I've had a pretty non-traditional professional forking path, my own garden of forking paths, starting from getting a degree in mass communications from a state university here in the US, to being a street performer in Amsterdam, to doing public affairs for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, picking up a couple of Emmys as a TV news photographer, which I did for 11 and a half years, and then really, pivoting, forking, inflecting myself and leaving the fourth estate. This was just about 14 years ago, to join a digital experience agency where I met my now best friend and partner in Possibility. We were at this place, Synergy. I ended up working with technology industry analysts from Gartner, Forrester, and IDC, which helped put us on KPMG's radar. We got acquired by KPMG, helped to start the innovation lab, scale that globally, went to BCG, created an innovation service offering, and almost a year ago, made a big jump, a massive pivot, inflected myself and got inflected and left BCG to jump into the great unknown. And the past, 9 months or so has been one of the most incredible hero's journeys I've ever been on in my life. So a brief intro. I always struggle with introducing myself, but maybe that helps explain it a little bit.
That's quite a winding journey. I mean, if I listened correctly there, I heard two real pivotal moments. One was where you stopped being a street performer in Amsterdam for whatever reason that might have been. And then more recently then when you decided to set up Valize. So what was the prompt for the second one? What prompted you to leave the career that you were in, which was by many people's standards, a very stable and the sort of thing that lots of people aspire to? You've taken this great big plunge. What made you make that move and join Rita and Kes in setting up Valize?
As with any massive decision in life that can really help shape your destiny, this was a fluke. The impetus was, it feels myopic to say it was ChatGPT, but really this tidal wave, we've called it the hype cyclone of AI and specifically generative AI. Having been in large management consulting for a decade or so as an innovator, seeing the disruptive force, the inflection point that generative AI represents for the management consulting industry, Kez and I recognized that we couldn't remain within that corporate structure and really capitalize, really take advantage of this massive change. This, as Rita McGrath talks about, inflection points are when there is a 10x change in what is possible. And what this technology represents, look, Kez has plenty of unfair advantages, including that he had started working on his PhD in AI over 30 years ago, lost his funding because, among others, Marvin Minsky said, hey, neural networks are worthless. And that's what he was working on.
Mm-hmm.
Parallel computation, genetic algorithms, before it was called deep learning. He brings that. We looked at all of these macro patterns. We're both meta and macro thinkers. And we said, these firms are not moving fast enough. This technology commoditizes their competitive advantage. Their moats are drying up. Knowledge and expertise are being commoditized by the most amazing technology humans have yet created, especially when you think about the fact that it is a thinking technology. It enables us to think with machines. So seeing all of these macro signals and having had this amazing fluking opportunity that Kez happened to be on a virtual InnoLead panel with Rita McGrath, Alex Osterwalder, and our good friend Scott Kersner, CEO and founder of InnoLead. Kez and Rita had a one-on-one conversation. They immediately bonded over what they saw in terms of this inflection point for management consulting. And we said, why don't we reinvent it?
Mm. So it's not so much that AI is taking your job or someone's job, but AI has prompted you to go after another industry and really create a new opportunity for you and your co-founders.
Well, absolutely. And seeing where this industry has gone off track, being a scholar practitioner and a scholar in the history of management consulting, it was an incredibly humbling honor to join BCG, the house that Bruce Henderson built. Right, the inflection point that he created in that industry when he created Boston Consulting Group back in the 60s, creating strategy consulting. Unfortunately, what we've seen is that it's lost its way. Between consulting organizations and their clients, they've created this codependent relationship that is not unlike the opioid crisis. And what Rita has been talking about since her PhD, a number of years ago, I won't say how many years ago, but Rita McGrath, her PhD from Wharton was about what she was talking a lot about competence building, and we're calling it capability building. We sincerely believe that the future success of business and this transformation that we are all going to have to go through is contingent on creating new capabilities. And that's what we, strong opinion, loosely held, believe that consulting and advisory organizations should be doing with their clients to make ourselves redundant, especially in the age of AI.
I think that's really interesting. You touched on quite a few things there that, as an economist, I can, reformed economist even, so more on the investment side. I think your strong opinion loosely held, whereas it's more loose opinion strongly held. But also thinking about competitive advantage. How do you put any sort of moat around this, other than just purely the individuals? Because obviously you can buy into the technology, and if you can't buy in, that's a moat. And the people that, how do you see this evolving? Because I think it's moved a lot quicker in the last couple of years. I mean, it's only really a couple of years since ChatGPT came out and people started using it on their LinkedIn. How do you see that going forward, given that's only 2 years? What do the next 8, 10 look like?
Well, the headline I'll say, the future of business looks a heck of a lot more like a real-time strategy game than chess or the game of Go. But I think, look, if you go back to what Rita has been talking about and her first solo book, The End of Competitive Advantage, that's when she really brought in this concept of transient advantage. From my perspective, I think it was what the internet enabled when we saw the proliferation of and the emergence and proliferation of platform business models. That completely disrupted, everything from Porter's Five Forces, even a lot of what Clay Christensen had talked about. You had to throw a lot of those playbooks out when it comes to competitive advantage. And Rita has talked again for years about this notion of transient competitive advantage. I think the new shift and what AI is really bringing in, especially when it's not only predictive, we've had prediction machines for a long, long time, right? And one of the core ways that our brains work is to predict, right? We're moving, we believe, from the era of prediction machines to the era of imagination machines, the ability to simulate futures, as opposed to doing backwards looking data analytics and machine learning like we've done for so many years. So the notion of competitive advantage moving forward, again, strong opinion loosely held, loose opinion strongly held, is that it's going to be more of a real-time concept of competitive advantage, where continuous learning, continuous experimentation, enabled by all of these emerging converging exponential technologies, that is what is going to give firms any sense of competitive advantage. But I think we're going from the really old model, certainly from the push model, the era of mass to mass to mass, to that pull model, where as we got into pull and then predict, we're seeing transient advantage as opposed to really being able to rely on some sort of a moat. And then finally to this point of what we're calling real-time business strategy.
And so how do you think the decision-making process has to change? Because getting people to make decisions, particularly at larger corporates, if you're trying to do things in real time, how do you get that just to come through and be efficient? Because otherwise you're going to be constantly getting out-competed.
I asked Rita over dinner a couple of months ago, what have you been trying to do your whole career? And she looked at me and she said, and she spit this out, and it was a humbling reminder of how brilliant she is. She said, look, all I'm trying to do is help companies be 2% less stupid. And I looked at her, I just awestruck. As somebody who likes to play with words, that phrase blew me away. That has actually been the core concept and the title that she has shifted to from this concept of what she's been talking about around permissionless organizations. So when you talk about decisions in an organization, that's where we see the most stupidity, right? Organizations that when you look at decisions that they have made that don't benefit themselves and don't benefit others, those are just stupid decisions. And how much of that could we attribute to the archaic command and control organizational structure that we typically see, as opposed to something like team of teams? Rita's talked for years about the concept that where you can really get the best intelligence is on the edges, right? Snow melts from the edges. What she's talking about with permissionless, and when it comes to decisions, it's got to be on the edges. How might we design organizational structures to enable and empower people on the edges of the organizations where the most important intelligence and decisions are happening, to be empowered to make decisions themselves, right? And whether you look at the military and team of teams, whether you look at Nordstrom as an organization that has a one-sentence rule book, use good judgment in all situations, it's not impossible. And when you think about these new technologies that we have, especially with AI, the fact that we can augment those folks on the edges of our organization, retail sales reps, customer service representatives, those at the tip of the spear, to be augmented and make better decisions and learn more. That's where we think we can start getting to this real-time business strategy, as well as helping organizations be, as Rita says, become 2% less stupid. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a few terms there that you've brought up a couple of times. And when I've followed things you've spoken about before, and I read a lot of what Rita writes as well. So you mentioned permissionless organizations a few times. You talked earlier about inflection points, and I know Rita also talks about seeing around corners. I think she might even have a book of the same name. Obviously, we don't have an infinite length to this podcast, but do you think you could pick a few of these terms, just define them for us briefly, and then maybe let us understand how these different concepts fit together in your vision?
No, it's a great question and an exercise in being concise for me. So I'll go with inflection points first, because that's what Rita has been writing about, talking about, researching, and she's creating an inflection point for herself now with this crazy new Kickstarter campaign that we're doing with her. Inflection points are these points when, as I mentioned earlier, there is a 10x change in what is possible. And that is, whereas Clay Christensen talked about disruption, Rita talks about inflection. And disruption, like, oh no, I got disrupted. Inflection, this is something that we believe is a little bit more empowering. So these are these massive 10x exponential changes in what is possible, whether it's from a political and organizational, even a personal level. Inflection points, if you think about your life, you can probably go back and think about those times. I've certainly had a couple, street performing in Amsterdam, leaving TV news. Those were inflection points, personal inflection points for me. How do you spot those? Because when you hit an inflection point, it is too late. Your degrees of freedom have shrunk. It is too late to make the change. You've gone off the cliff. So how do you see around corners? How do you spot inflection points on the horizon? Yes, I would highly and humbly recommend reading Rita McGrath's book, Seeing Around Corners, to get a better sense of how do you get those early warning signals, that signal advantage, that sensory advantage. And how do you do that? Then you get to this notion of permissionless organization. You're going to get the most intelligence, help see around corners, spot inflection points far before they happen on the edges of your organization. This is true in biology. This is true for organizational structures. And so with this notion of permissionless, as I was talking about, really pushing those decision rights to the edges of the organization, where when they are spotting signals of potential inflection points, they can not only bubble that back up to the core intelligence that is a business operating system, but they can take action, in Kairos, right? The God of the opportune moment, in the moment, at the moment, whether it's, those decision points, pushing those further to the edges of the organization. So I hope that makes sense, because in my mind, they're all connected. And it's this whole notion of helping companies become 2% less stupid. You're spotting inflection points before they happen. You're seeing around corners, and you're enabling those decision rights at the edges.
If I may make a comment that's probably 2% more stupid, isn't that just the same as agile? Haven't companies been trying to do agile for the last 15 years?
It's one thing to say agile, and it's another thing to do it. From what I have seen, many agile practices and practitioners, of course, are you talking big A agile or small A agile? But they are not truly agile. When we see the kinds of decisions that are made by organizations, even ones that are as savvy, these tech giants and platform business models, where they optimize their algorithms for engagement and weaponize, social connection inadvertently, unintended consequences. Look, I think agile has failed. That's, agile is what a lot of move fast and break things folks, call their practice when they're trying to translate innovation to a larger organization. They say, oh, well, it's agile. Well, it's agile. We'll move fast and break things. But I humbly believe that just simply calling something agile, throwing things against the wall, hoping it'll work, the iterations without, that the way that organizations have been actually operating when they say that they are operating with agility, it's simply not true. And it's not intelligent.
No, I'm fully with you there. So Scott, last time you and I spoke, you threw a 4-letter word at me, but obviously not that kind of 4-letter word. It was all very polite. We'd been touching on the topic of VUCA, which I think most listeners are familiar with. So volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. But you mentioned another 4-letter acronym that I hadn't heard before, and that was BANI. Or how do you say that? BANI or BANI? Can you tell us what that means and what we should take from it?
It's an interesting, and I will say, as somebody who loves to come up with really good acronyms, autological acronyms, BANI is a terrible acronym. It's intriguing to me. So I learned about it from reading Team, which is David Allen's most recent book around getting things done, with groups. And as I dug into it, this BANI, so BANI, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, incomprehensible. And one particular researcher, last name Cascio, presented this in the throes of COVID and looked at what was happening with COVID. And this was somebody who I guess thought, VUCA doesn't help us anymore. VUCA, maybe it's just for the military. A lot, I guess, concerns, criticisms. VUCA was developed in the Cold War and it's outdated. We need a new mental model. Brittle, anxious, nonlinear, incomprehensible. One that is not only, well, look, VUCA itself, but what is VUCA? It's not a great acronym. It doesn't automatically, give you the right mental model around volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. But when it comes to sense making, it holds up. It is not outdated. The notion that the world we live in is creating anxiety and that it's incomprehensible, to me, that is not a great mental model. That's not how I view the world. That's not how, look, yes, I admit we don't have free will, but we have free won't and we have free want. There's no reason to be anxious when we have agency over the future. The fact that you would consider something incomprehensible, it's just throwing your hands up. It's giving up. It's the opposite of grit. So I think it's a really, really interesting mental model. And again, we all struggled to try to make sense of our lives and meaning and everything in the world around us during COVID. But again, I thought it was a really interesting mental model. Brittle, anxious, nonlinear, incomprehensible. But the more that I've thought about it, as interesting as it is, I don't think it helps me be a better thinker.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's really interesting. Do you think it's affecting the way organizations think about their strategy? I mean, we've seen, I think it's fair to say organizations have become a lot more anxious in the last couple of years, certainly being much more short-termist in the way they invest in the future or don't invest in the future. What do you see as some of the implications of what we've seen lately for the organizations and for individuals themselves, so whether it be employees or entrepreneurs?
What I will say is I'm flashing back to so many presentations I did. I was at KPMG, really in the throes of COVID. And the fact that going through this global pandemic, this total inflection point, macro inflection point, where suddenly talking about nonlinear change didn't come across as like a total nerd, like academic concept. That we in our organization, we're talking about VUCA. We've been talking about it for years as innovators. It's an amazing mental model, right? Coming from the military to make sense of these kinds of the complexity of the world in which we live. And so what I like about it, and I'll even go to Banny, I like that concept of saying brittle, because it's, to me, it recognizes the brittle nature of so many of these systems that we have designed, whether you look at the unintended consequences of the tech debt that organizations have built up, right? That acknowledging that we are experiencing exponential nonlinear change, I think is really, really empowering. So what I think the challenge has been for organizations, so whether you embrace VUCA or you say, oh, Banny is going to help us inform our strategy and how we design our organization and our products and our services and operations and everything, if you're actually thinking about it and bringing in the right kinds of tools and mental models and systems thinking and new ways of learning and development, that is going to help these anxious organizations deal with an incomprehensible world. At least that's my, as I always love to say, my hypothesis.
Hypothesis, nice.
And how do you feel that this approach maybe helps management consultants? And I appreciate there's a range of management consultants. So maybe give sort of our listeners who aren't familiar a brief sort of overview on how you see maybe the big four versus MBB. And then you've also got all the little boutiques, which again, those are sort of popping up, as you say, with the help of AI and the like. But how do you see that evolving?
I'm not sure. I do have a lot of thoughts. I sincerely believe, my hypothesis is that if the big four, so Deloitte, Ernst & Young, EY, PwC, and KPMG, and MBB, the strat firms, the management consulting firms, McKinsey, Bain, BCG, and some of the more mid-tier management consulting firms, and there's a massive, massive number of them, if they do not fundamentally transform their business and operating models to take advantage of these emerging, converging, exponential technologies, create permissionless organizations, recognize this kind of real change, they will cease to exist. It's as simple as that. It was difficult being at BCG and talking to leaders and telling them, if we were advising clients in any other industry and we saw that their competitive advantage was being wiped out There's been this knowledge asymmetry. We used to have information asymmetry. We've gone up the chain from data to information to knowledge and wisdom, right? There had been this knowledge and expertise asymmetry between management consulting firms and their clients. With generative AI, that's gone. The pyramid model that by which those traditional firms operate, with partners at the top and a ton of, certainly with McKinsey, Bain, and BCG, a lot of Ivy League business school grads at the bottom, slaving away, doing things that generative AI does better and faster and cheaper than people. You're done. So when I think about VUCA or BANI or AI, and I look at this industry that is at an inflection point, my hope for them is that they will embrace these concepts and fundamentally start making changes. If they don't, they're just not going to be around.
Do you think that you could see a breakup of the larger, almost conglomerates into smaller boutiques with people with expertise, or do you think they could just fade away? I mean, it obviously won't play out overnight, but stranger things have happened inside the car industry in the States and the like. How does that happen, or is it just a slow motion car crash?
I love the phrase from Hemingway. Rita has talked about it. It was almost the title of Seeing Around Corners, as she shared with us. It's gradually and then suddenly.
Yeah.
I'm going to be very, very curious to see what these large incumbent firms do. One of my hypotheses is that we're going to see, similar to the rise of the digital agencies that came out of the internet, and especially the mobile era. And when we saw, it was like hungry hippos, with the big four, certainly Accenture. I mean, Accenture is whatever is beyond a hippo, right? In terms of the acquisition spree. Yeah. Exactly. So I think we're going to see a lot of M&A by the incumbents while they can. But I will not be surprised in the next 18 to 24 months, potentially, if the big four becomes the big three. I don't know about McKinsey, Bain, and BCG. I'll be really interested. I'd love to see these incumbents actually start spinning out innovative little startups like what Kez and I are doing with Rita. Why don't you fund the startups that are going to inflect your business instead of waiting to be inflected? So I'm really, really interested. I'm in this strange position where we're reinventing management consulting. And at the same time, we're also talking to some of these organizations about how we could help them transform, because we always know how much more effective it can be to bring in, outside, ideally objective third parties with credibility, expertise, and all of those things to help you do the kind of transformation you can't do yourself. That's true for an individual. That's true for an organization, as far as I'm concerned.
And can you tell us about some of the solutions that you offer? And sort of the positive. You're obviously a very positive person anyway, but sort of the positive behaviours and attitudes that you encourage at the firms and at the leaders when they are feeling anxious and non-linear. I mean, when I think of non-linear, I think of Pulp Fiction, sort of the non-linear film. But I guess having that approach.
Yeah, Pulp Fiction, Christopher Nolan. I'm a huge fan of Tarantino and Christopher Nolan, and boy, Memento in terms of non-linearity. Still can't get enough of that. But in terms of what we're bringing to market, it is all discovery driven. I'll be very, very honest. This is what Rita has been talking about since 1995. Interesting year when both she and Clay Christensen published their seminal articles in Harvard Business Review. I will let you in on a little secret that Rita was the primary author and Clay was the secondary, but that's neither here nor there. Discovery-driven planning. So discovery-driven growth is one of the capabilities, the services, as it were, that we're offering. But to be very honest, everything that we're offering from our perspective is discovery-driven, because we start with that assumption that we don't know what we don't know about how we can help an organization. So we have these four initial service offerings, and I say discovery-driven growth because, again, it's this notion of capability building, helping organizations not only understand the theory, but learn, understand, embrace, adopt the tools that are a part of the discovery-driven toolkit. Early warning systems and tripwires, two complementary services when it comes to that anxiety that we're seeing organizations deal with. It's not necessarily something new, but I think perhaps like the anxious generation, we're seeing an anxious generation of leaders and organizations. How can you reduce that anxiety about the future? Well, what if you have that signal advantage? What if you have an early warning system that's based on this concept of identifying what could represent a 10x change in your business and then working backwards from that to then set up tripwires where you can have some of that anticipatory governance, anticipatory decision making. So having tripwires ahead of an inflection point. So early warning systems and tripwires. And then the final one, which we're talking about this concept of, I mentioned earlier, the evolving from prediction machines to imagination machines, something that technology that we've created has never really been able to do like our brains can. It's this notion of what we're calling strategic imagination machines. That's an acronym I'm proud of. SIMs are what we believe represent the future of strategy and innovation for organization. Whether you're creating a strategic imagination machine that's really more of a diegetic prototype or a design fiction to help leaders suspend disbelief about change, to really imagine and immerse in a possible future so that they can feel it, so that they can believe it, right? That's what Eric Ries missed when he watered down Rita's research and created Lean Startup. It was believability. Yes, you need desirability, viability, and feasibility. You need believability if you're going to affect change. That's true for an individual. That's true for an organization. So we've got this offering around strategic imagination machines. It's like scenario planning on steroids, taking advantage especially of generative AI. So those are a few of the things that we're bringing to market, again, to help leaders navigate this VUCA world, especially if they feel like it's incomprehensible and if they individually or as an organization are operating in a way that appears anxious. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what we're doing. And again, it is, all driven by this discovery-driven concept, which again, if it works for evolution, it'll probably work pretty well for our organization.
And what do you think that people have really embraced that's maybe surprised you, and what have they kind of let fall by the wayside that has also surprised you? Because I think sometimes what consultants can bring, they think it's all great ideas and you like one bit and you don't like another bit, but sometimes you think, well, actually that's my best idea, and they leave that to one side. Is there anything that's really surprised you in that way?
So that's a great question. I think what has surprised me has been the positive reception, especially when we talk about these strategic imagination machines, and then the way that these organizations are acting. So it's not necessarily surprise in terms of what we have presented in terms of what we think might be a pre-inflection model or a maximum discovery prototype, as we've loosely termed some of these ideas that we've brought to market. But it is the embrace of the truly transformative power of especially this new AI technology, this third wave of AI that we're surfing, and the lack of action. And this is, we spent some time working with a large PC manufacturer, and the first order thinking, kind of the low hanging fruit that they're looking at in terms of AI to automate sales and marketing. Right? We've seen that race to the bottom before. So I think that has surprised me. Talking to colleagues from, large management consulting firms who have had no training in generative AI other than a cursory prompt engineering course. So, seeing the traction that we're starting to get, especially around early warning systems and SIMs, and then seeing the way that these organizations are actually acting and going, man, can we help them become 2% less stupid?
So, Scott, as a curious human, I think you've generated a huge amount of curiosity today. So if our listeners would like to reach out to you and learn more about yourself and about Valize, what are the best ways of reaching you?
Well, certainly you can check out Valize.com. That's VALIZE.com. That is the organization that Rita created a few years ago with the intent of not simply creating intellectual property and businesses that are directly associated with her name. So Valize.com, if you want to learn more about how Rita McGrath, Kez Sampanthar, myself, and a few other rogues, rascals, and rapscallions are helping to reinvent management consulting. And if you want to learn more about me, as you said, I'm a curious human. I spend a non-insignificant amount of time thinking and working in public on LinkedIn. Kez and I do a semi-weekly LinkedIn Live show called Tectonic, all about thinking with machines and this new wave of AI. Kez has a Substack around Centaurian, but LinkedIn is definitely where to find out more about me. Plenty of rabbit holes on my profile.
Right. Well, all the links will be in the description of this podcast episode. We're going to wrap up in just a couple of minutes, but I just have to ask you an AI question. It's the obligatory topic in today's day and age, as you know. So you've heard this saying, and I think it emerged earlier this year, that the US innovates, China imitates, Europe regulates. So you're based in the US. How do you see it from your perspective?
I love the phrase, like the saying goes, all models are wrong, some are useful. This is one that I'm not sure how useful it is in this day and age. I love it because it rhymes. But when I think about how China has leapfrogged, as an AI superpower, the fact that 8 years ago, I was captivated by this New York Times video about WeChat. And here in America, we still have nothing even remotely close to WeChat. Don't get me started on how much I dislike pennies and physical money. When we look at Europe and that regulation, what could the US learn from the way that Europe has regulated, the way that Europe has, dare I say, collaborated across a lot of different parties, a lot of different cultures? What could the US learn from that regulation? And yes, the US is still, I think, seen as that leading innovator. But man, when I start looking, if I just think about AI, and I start looking at some of the models and the work that I'm hearing about coming out of China, things like Mistral coming out of France. Look, let's not forget the Middle East is, well, a major hotbed, but still, think about the startup proliferation in the Middle East, whether it's Israel or the massive amounts of money that the Saudis are pouring into AI innovation and technology. So I like it as a model, but I'm not sure that the US innovates, China imitates, and Europe regulates still holds up today. Strong opinion, loosely held.
I like it. What about the scaling up though? Because we've seen some of the deep technologies coming out of Europe and China as well. But when it comes to getting that VC funding really growing and even going to IPO, it's only really the US that seems to have that capability, right?
It seems like we have that. This is where I think that there is plenty of room for change and dare I say inflection. Look, one of the reasons that we're going to Kickstarter with Rita McGrath, she just turned 65 years old, the classic retirement age. Why would Rita McGrath launch something on Kickstarter? We believe that Kickstarter actually represents a far greater disruption and disruptive threat and inflection for traditional VC. So when it comes to scaling up, we think we might actually be able to bootstrap the management consulting firm of the future with a Kickstarter. I, want to believe, I do believe, this is my hypothesis, that as these barriers to entry continue to drop and crumble, that we're going to start seeing the democratization of funding for more disruptive, innovative business models. And I think looking at something like a Kickstarter, that could be, that concept of the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. I think we're going to start seeing some major changes. And then, and I'll leave it with this because, boy, a few years ago, we probably only would have been talking about blockchain and Web3 and the metaverse. That is only dormant. I believe that when Web3 comes back and all of the underlying technologies, that's where we're going to start seeing some massive, massive disruption and probably an inflection point for the opportunities represented by geography. I do want to see those distinctions drop. And I think technology, as it always has, to connect us more than we've ever been connected before, you might as well say that we are the least connected that we will ever be today. And so with that greater connectivity, with the technological proliferation and empowerment and democratization, I think we're going to start seeing a lot more different opportunities when it comes to geography.
That's really fantastic, Scott. So I want to say a massive thank you to you for joining us on the podcast today. If I may say so, I think this might even be an inflection point in our podcast series. The knowledge, the wisdom, and the opportunity to really think differently about this stuff, I think is really fantastic. So thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure. And well, we look forward to following the hopeful success of your Kickstarter campaign in the very near future.
Thank you both. Again, this was a sincere privilege, pleasure, and just an absolute delight to spend some time with you both.
Thanks, Scott.